CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories this hour. Fresh fears of fighting in Sudan as the army suspends truce talks. Tensions mount as Germany says it will close all but one of the Russian consulates across the country. Trade, tech, AI regulation and China. European and US officials meet for high-level talks in Sweden. And the bill to raise the US debt ceiling passes its first hurdle, but can it get through the next round? While Sudan is braced for renewed violence after the army suspended ceasefire talks with the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Earlier this week, the two factions had agreed to a 5-day extension on the humanitarian truce brokered by Saudi Arabia and the United States. While the ceasefire was repeatedly violated by both sides, it did allow for the delivery of aid to an estimated 2 million people. Well, fighting broke out between the rival factions on April the 15th. The conflict is now into its 7th week. The World Health Organization says at least 850 people have been killed and more than 5,000 injured. Other agencies on the ground say the death toll is closer to 1,800. The United Nations says close to 1.5 million people have been displaced, with around 350,000 fleeing to neighbouring countries, including Egypt, Chad and South Sudan. Cuts to water and power supplies and limited access to hospitals has deepened the humanitarian crisis. More than half the population require aid, with 13.6 million children in urgent need of life-saving humanitarian support. That's the highest number on record for the country. Sudan was already suffering from a hunger crisis before the conflict started. Around 16 million people were affected by acute food insecurity. That number is expected to jump to more than 19 million in the coming months due to disruptions to supply routes. And despite aid beginning to trickle in since the humanitarian ceasefire was agreed, the World Food Programme says some 17,000 metric tons of food aid has been lost to looting since the start of the fighting. Our correspondent Naba Mohideen is live in Madani in Sudan for us. Naba, why have the ceasefire talks been suspended?
The military said the RSF is violating the ceasefire. This is why they are suspending the talks, and they also said the RSF are not committing to the terms of the agreement signed in Jeddah, which is the still occupation of the hospitals and residencies and the neighborhoods. So the RSF are still located and they are still controlling some hospitals and neighborhoods. The military said they are suspending the talks in Jeddah, which is a card that the military is using it to say that the RSF is not committing to the ceasefire and they cannot go forward in these talks unless the RSF adhere to the terms of the agreement. This is why the military is suspending the talks in Jeddah unless the RSF withdraw from the neighborhoods and from the hospitals and all of the civilians buildings. Till that, we will see a collapse of the security situation in the country, and we will see more confrontations between the two warring factions.
And what impact could this have on the humanitarian crisis?
Of course, the impact will be very big regarding the humanitarian crisis. The people in the capital and other states are already suffering a dire situation, but the news about suspending any talks and ceasefire, because it's a humanitarian ceasefire and it was already dedicated for delivery of aid, that will of course have a very big impact on the humanitarian situation, and more organizations and United Nations agencies will not be able to deliver any aid, this will have great impact on the people inside the capital and other states, especially Darfur, Northern Kordofan, Khartoum state, and other regions, because the collapse of ceasefire and the suspension of the talks will definitely make it very hard to even evaluate the situation or assess it, and because in the past ceasefires and in the past sponsored ceasefires, it was monitored by mechanisms so they can determine and they can evaluate the ceasefires and they can evaluate the situation. But now the situation will be more unclear and more fragile, and of course it will have a great impact on the delivery of humanitarian aid, medicine, food, and all kind of assistance, especially for the people in the capital, as it will witness, we are expecting that it will witness fierce fighting again, and without any sign of a soon relief.
Our correspondent Naba Mohideen in Madani, thank you very much. Germany says it will shut down 4 out of 5 Russian consulates in the country. The Russian government would still be allowed to operate its embassy in Berlin and 1 general consulate, but Germany expects the rest to cease operations by the end of this year. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is live in Moscow for us. Why has Germany made this move, Stuart?
Well, it came in response to something Moscow did at the weekend when it set a lower limit on how many German officials can be in Russia at any one time. It lowered the limit to 350 personnel. That means the German Foreign Ministry says that many of its staff would have to either leave the country or lose their jobs. It said that most of these staff would have to be lost in areas such as cultural institutions, schools and nurseries. So the German Foreign Ministry said, and I quote, "In the interests of parity of personnel and structures, it would have to close the majority of the consulates still open." It said it also took into consideration that it believed that because of the so-called quote, war in Ukraine, there was simply no longer any basis for bilateral structures. As that's going on in Germany, in the United Kingdom, there is a message from Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who says that the UK, as Russia's, quote, eternal enemy, its civil servants and officials will be potential targets, military targets, because of the statements and the actions that they are taking in supporting Ukraine with strategic information and also equipment. That was in response to James Cleverly, the defense minister, who suggested that there was a legitimate reason for Ukraine to be targeting infrastructure outside of Ukraine itself and on Russian territory in relation to the drone attacks, for example, earlier in the week.
Well, let's talk a bit more about that. Meanwhile, Russia reporting increasing attacks by Ukraine in its territory. What's been alleged?
Yeah, that's right. So Moscow gets all the headlines because it's so unusual for a drone attack to take place here. But across the rest of the country, especially in the southwest, these attacks are far more common. So, for example, an oil refinery, which has been the target of attacks before, was again hit. Having said that, it didn't cause any damage, at least according to the local officials there, and nor was a fire started, which is what the result was last time an alleged Ukrainian drone hit that refinery. There was also reports of shelling in Luhansk, the annexed region of Ukraine. That there resulted in 5 deaths and 19 wounded, according to a local official in that village.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thank you. Ursula von der Leyen has reiterated the EU support for Ukraine at a security conference in Slovakia. The European Commission President told delegates in Bratislava that Russian withdrawal remained the starting point of any potential peace settlement.
Above all, there must be one principle. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So together with Ukraine, we want a just peace, one that does not reward the aggressor, but one that upholds the principles of the UN Charter and the Ukrainian people's right to be the masters of their own future.
In other news, NATO peacekeepers in northern Kosovo have set up barbed wire barriers to stop protesters following regional unrest, which has left dozens of international troops and demonstrators injured. Days of violence prompted NATO to send 700 additional soldiers to boost its 4,000-strong mission. Clashes intensified following the mayoral and assembly elections in April. Ethnic Serbs boycotted the votes, leaving only ethnic Albanians and some small minorities elected into posts. A satellite launched by the DPRK suffered a technical fault and crashed into the sea, the country's state media said, in a rare admission of failure. The launch caused alarm across the region, setting off air raid sirens and evacuation warnings in South Korea and Japan. And bail for Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan has been extended until June the 19th. He was arrested in early May on allegations of corruption involving the Al-Qadir University Trust, which he heads alongside his wife. Khan has denied any wrongdoing and says the case is politically motivated. You're watching CGTN, still to come. The end of the road. Why the move by local councils in England to close off some residential roads to tackle pollution is proving unpopular with some drivers.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. Fears of fresh fighting in Sudan as the army suspends ceasefire talks. And tensions mount as Germany says it will close all but one of the Russian consulates across the country. While top European and United States officials are meeting for high-level talks in Sweden with trade, tech, AI regulation and China high on the agenda. Our correspondent Trent Murray is following developments for us from Berlin. So, Trent, we've just heard from US Secretary of State Blinken and the EU's Commissioner for Competition, Margrethe Vestager. What did they have to say?
Yeah, Paul, I've just been listening in on that press conference of the EU-US Tech and Trade Council. It's a bit of a wordful, but what it essentially sees is the leaders of the EU and the US come together in the area of trade and technology. We know that big discussion points this year were issues around new and emerging technology, also building sustainable, de-riskified, if you will, supply chains post-COVID-19. What we heard from both sides was a lot of the word convergence, effectively both sides of the Atlantic trying to say that they are increasingly singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to some of these challenging issues, including issues like rare earth minerals and making sure supply chains can get access to them for things like microchips and batteries. We also heard more work being done on protecting miners online. But I think the big one, which was a big topic today, was this emerging issue of what's called generative AI. We've all heard a lot about it in recent months, ChatGPT and others. There's a big push underway, particularly by the European Union, to put together a faster voluntary code of conduct for countries to sign up for. Effectively, what Anthony Blinken had to say about that was so often in the past when new technology emerges, there's often such a long period of time between when it's affecting people's lives and when the government catches up and brings in regulation. The view in Europe is that the government needs to work really fast here because the lasting impacts of AI could be huge and there's a need to make sure it's regulated properly.
And Trent, what are the sticking points remaining during these discussions? And have they agreed on anything on how to work with China?
Well, look, we haven't had any firm announcements in relation to China. The word China was actually only mentioned twice in the 24-page draft statement, but it was still very much a big topic of conversation. We heard discussions from Anthony Blinken and the European side on issues like supply chains, on issues like investment protection mechanisms, as he described it. I thought one of the interesting quotes from him was that none of us, and by none of us he meant the EU and US, is looking for confrontation or for Cold War or for decoupling from China, just de-risking certain industries, particularly supply chains in the West. Let's have a listen to what Secretary Blinken had to say about that broader issue.
Ultimately, what we're about, if we do things right, is creating a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. On both sides of the Atlantic, we have now unleashed incredibly powerful incentives to try to drive innovation and complement and spur private sector investment. But we've got to do it in a way, again, that is complementary.
And what we also heard, though, was that while there may be areas of disagreement between DC and Brussels and Beijing, that where there is agreement on all sides is that the lines of communication need to remain firmly open. Secretary Blinken spoke about the fact that President Biden and President Xi were able to speak in Bali last year at the G20. There is hopes similar meetings could be set up for the G20 this year in India, because in his view, those conversations are important for finding common ground and strengthening cooperation in areas of mutual interest.
OK, many thanks, Trent. Trent Murray there in Berlin. The House of Representatives in the US will vote later on a bill to lift the US debt ceiling, a critical step to prevent the government defaulting on its loan repayments. The bill passed its first hurdle on Tuesday night, but the next round is expected to be tight. Let's speak to our correspondent now, John Terrett in New York. John, we seem to be edging closer to a final deal.
Edging, but no guarantees. I must caution you, this is the deal that was struck between the Republican and the Democratic leadership late on Saturday night. It cleared its first hurdle, as you were saying. It had to go to the Rules Committee, first of all, on Tuesday, when everybody got back after the long weekend. And even though there was a lot of acrimony and a lot of displeasure among members of that committee, it did exit the committee and is now heading for a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives sometime later today. Now, the headlines in the bill are that the debt ceiling has effectively been abolished for the next 2 years. We won't have to worry about it again until 2025, after the November 2024 presidential election. And the cuts I would now describe as relatively moderate, quite frankly. It depends really where you stand politically on how you would describe these cuts. They're mostly in domestic spending. Military and defense spending has been increased. Social Security, Medicare, that's kind of been left alone. Progressives are unhappy about some requirements that people will have to go through in order to claim benefits, and there's issues about drilling for oil. The ultra-right of the Republican Party is unhappy that the cuts simply don't go deep enough. The Congressional Budget Office says it will save $1.5 trillion in the deficit. That's the difference between the money the government brings in and the money it spends. If it's signed, then it will prevent a default, and the most serious effect of that overseas for our viewers would have been individuals, companies and countries who had invested in government bonds here wouldn't get the interest payment on time, and that's the thing that would most likely trigger a recession, potentially a global one. Paul?
So, John, take us through, if you will, what happens later on today, Wednesday.
Well, don't get your hopes up. Let's see how this goes. Basically, it goes now to the floor of the House of Representatives, which is controlled by the Republican Party. They have a slim majority, but they do have a majority. So we are told to expect a vote. I think the meeting's getting underway more or less now, actually, up on Capitol Hill. But we're told to expect a vote between 19:30 GMT Wednesday and 01:30 GMT on Thursday. So for people watching in Europe, that will be later tonight, Wednesday, early Thursday morning. Many people will want to have their say, though, both progressives and ultra-right-wingers. Let's assume that there is a vote today and that it passes. It will go then to the Senate, which is the great debating chamber. Now, Chuck Schumer, who's the senior senator for the state of New York and the majority leader in the Senate, says he'll keep all senators back. There are 100 of them. They will stay in Washington, D.C. for this weekend to debate the bill. If they make any amendments, it's got to go back to the House. Now, our producer, Joseph, doesn't think that there will be any amendments, but if they do amend in the Senate, it'll have to go back to the House, and the deadline is looming. I'm looking for it to be on the President's desk sometime around Sunday, I would think, and then the US officially defaults with an official serious deadline now of next Monday, the 5th of June.
We will see. John Terrett, thank you very much indeed for that update. Kenya's president has called for a resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict that is respectful to both nations. The call came during a bilateral meeting between President William Ruto and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Nairobi. The two leaders also discussed an agreement that will boost trade between the two countries. Robert Nagila has more.
Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, flew into Nairobi early on Monday for a one-day working visit. Lavrov held bilateral talks with Kenya's President William Ruto at State House, Nairobi. According to a statement released by the presidency late on Monday afternoon, the talks featured the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has been raging for the past 13 months. Kenya maintained its position on the respect for territorial integrity of member states and called for a resolution that respects both parties. President Ruto also announced the two countries will sign a trade pact once a framework is in place. The two leaders also agreed to strengthen ties and increase current trade volumes. Russia is the fifth largest importer of Kenyan tea, while Kenya imports iron, steel, wheat, fertilizer, copper and oil. Also discussed was the need to reform the United Nations Security Council for Africa to get a permanent seat. This was the Russian foreign minister's fourth visit to Africa in the past 14 months, as Moscow seeks to strengthen ties around the continent. Lavrov travels to South Africa next for a BRICS foreign ministers meeting. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi.
Tesla boss Elon Musk is in China on his first visit to the country in 3 years. He's met senior government ministers in the capital, Beijing, and reportedly told the foreign ministry that American and Chinese economies were like conjoined twins. Musk is also expected to visit Tesla's plant in Shanghai, the company's largest production hub. South Korea's first same-sex marriage bill is going through Parliament. The marriage equality bill was proposed by a cross-party group of lawmakers. It's unlikely to pass, but forms part of a series of bills expected to increase pressure on the government to expand the idea of family beyond traditional criteria. An increasing number of local councils in England have closed off some residential roads to vehicles to reduce pollution and the impact of heavy traffic. But that's not popular with everyone. Lee Junhua reports.
This is one of the many protests where people are voicing their frustration at restrictions on driving. Local councils in some parts of the UK are closing smaller residential roads to vehicles under the schemes known as low-traffic neighbourhoods. The plan is to reduce emissions and accidents, but there is a lot of opposition. Ella believes her freedoms are being taken away.
They're trying to force people to stop driving, but they're not thinking about the people that can't stop driving. They're not thinking about people that can just walk down the road. They're not thinking about the people with disabilities or maybe 3 kids, single parents. They can't take their toddlers and 2 other kids down the road, like to go to get some eggs. They can't do it. It's not possible to get them all out of the house, to drive them down the road, to get the eggs, to come back to cook dinner.
Those in favour of the measures argue that any disruption is far outweighed by the benefits and the urgency of the climate crisis.
Freedom to drive comes at a massive cost for society. You know, the costs of pollution, of air quality, of road danger, of inactivity all over London. You know, the public health teams are desperate for people to move more, and they agree that actually what we need is people to have more freedom to not have to drive. I think we're quite keen to help look at this all from a non-driver point of view. And there are plenty of people who can't drive for medical reasons because they're disabled and can't drive.
Citywide schemes are also a cause of much debate. The UK capital's ultra-low emission zone will massively expand this August to cover the whole of Greater London, forcing the owners of older cars that don't meet emissions requirements to pay a daily charge. While road restrictions are looming large in local politics, similar debates are taking place all the way up the political ladder worldwide. The UK government will ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. An EU plan to ban all combustion engines by 2035 was heavily watered down after strong opposition. In China, the only new cars for sale starting 2035 will be new energy ones. Since mass production began about 100 years ago, the motor car has been an emblem of personal freedom. But now, the personal freedom has been challenged as politicians try to promote greener travel. But the question is how far they can afford to disrupt the everyday lives of voters now in order to protect the future environment. Li Jianhua, CGTN, London.
And finally, it's a phenomenon that brings the city that never sleeps to a standstill. Traffic paused briefly in parts of New York as thousands gathered to witness a solar event known as Manhattanhenge. Just as the UK's prehistoric Stonehenge is aligned with summer and winter solstice, the east-west streets of Manhattan also perfectly frame the rising and setting sun twice a year. The city-stopping spectacle is usually occurring around Memorial Day and a week or so after Independence Day. And the headlines again. Fears of fresh fighting in Sudan as the army suspends ceasefire talks. Tensions mount as Germany says it will close all but one of the Russian consulates across the country. And the US debt ceiling bill is facing a narrow path to passage in the House of Representatives. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. There's more on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or you can scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. And we're back with more news at the top of the hour. Up next, it's World Insight with Tian Wei. Bye for now.
Hello and welcome to the weather forecast. I'm Danny. Well, over to Europe. Weather pattern here for the majority of Europe in terms of the wet weather will be pretty much like a sandwich on Thursday. And there we could see two pieces of wet weather setting the stage here up in the north and down in the south respectively, with a potential thunderstorm to pop up. And for the areas in between, we'll see a large spell of cloudy to clear conditions. And no big change in the wet weather forecast as we head into this Friday. In terms of the temperature development over the next couple of days, quite a lot of warmer temperatures are likely to develop here for a large portion from UK all the way towards into West Russia on Thursday. And we can notice that round of cooler temperatures will be pushing in from the north all the way down towards into northern Germany from Thursday into Friday. So please be well prepared and dress up accordingly. And about a business and travel for many major cities up in the north. An overcast condition for Stockholm with a high of 12 degrees Celsius in the forecast here for the city of Helsinki on Friday. And over to Moscow, we'll see a high of 23 and though about 10 degrees Celsius. For other major cities across the western portion of Europe, Paris will see plenty of sunshine and a high of 23 degrees Celsius is in the forecast for the city of Madrid with a chance of showers on Friday. And that is all from me. Stay tuned for more City Forecast.